Citroën, not the default brand that hits your head the moment you think of buying a car in the Indian automotive marketplace. But this French brand has been building in India gradually. They of course launched with the C5 Aircross, which frankly has been priced at an absolutely absurd level. Does not really make a lot of sense at that price point. But then the brand went very actively down the ladder and they introduced the C3 and then the EC3. Both of these hatchbacks have been doing whatever little they can for the brand. But this car is quite possibly the most crucial product for Citroën in India. It's the C3 Aircross. In terms of the exterior design execution, I think it's a fairly smart looking car, nothing really overdone at all. The side is of course a little bit featureless, but it's the front and the rear that really has a lot going on, and we'll talk through it. First of all, I absolutely love the Citroën logo, the chevrons that sit at the top. Very, very nice and gives almost like a snout-like presence, so that's nicely done. And then as you go down, you will notice that the entire grille section is divided basically by this bumper element over here running in the middle as a contrasting color. Also done in a contrasting color are these plastic brackets over here. It stands out because it's highlighted by white or some other color. But a very, very good strong front end, and then as you go along at the back, it just builds the character of the car a bit more, and you get very nice and very unique sort of treatments, especially the tail lamps. I think they have been executed in a very nice way, and you have a nice 3D look to them. And overall, the shape at the back is fairly flat, but at the same time, there is nothing wrong with it. You will not really find anything very obtuse about it, and fairly smart looking thing at the back as well. On the inside, it's a mixed bag, and to be fair, the design of the dashboard is pretty smart, and if you know your Citroëns, you will identify with a few design highlights here and there. The vents, for example, very neatly laid out, and just the overall execution is also pretty smart. But it's when you start looking under the surface and you explore some bits here and there that you start to realize that it's not a very robustly or a very well put together cabin. Like for example, this thing just moves even with one hand, and this is the main center console which houses a complete link to the gearbox. So it's just bizarre that you even have this kind of a quality going on over here in the center. Seats fairly narrow. I think if you are a little portly or large bodied, you will have a little bit of a trouble adjusting on the seats. I was in the passenger seat and I had another journalist friend who was driving the car at the time, and he happened to engage the reverse gear, and the reach is so far to the left that it rubbed against my knee. So it just tells you that the entire cabin is fairly narrow, fairly tight, and definitely fitting 3 people in the back is an absolutely no-go. Specific to the driver's seat and this driver's armrest, it locks at an angle and it points down, so it's not the most intuitive or the most natural position for your arm to rest on it, and it's also not the most natural way that you reach out onto the gear lever. So I think it should have had multiple levels of locking so that you could have achieved a good, comfortable seating position for yourself. What Citroën has done well is the real estate management over here in the center. There are no fake buttons, there are no dead buttons, there is no fakery generally going on, and everything has a purpose. You have the AC controls over here. There are a couple of charging ports. Type C is missing. That's probably a missed opportunity. I think Citroën should have gone for both a Type A and a Type C, but well, that's a debate for another day. But the biggest change is in the screen experience. Using it is a breeze now. It is a completely different hardware, completely different software as well. It's a far cry from what Citroën has given us in the past, and comes with wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. Things on the back are pretty decent. The front seat is set for my driving position, and I still have enough knee room, and there is enough space under the front seat for me to glide my feet under, so that's all very good. The seat itself is pretty decent as well. Could have been slightly better on the bolstering, but really not really a big complaint over there. And the cushioning is absolutely spot on. I think it's very, very nicely judged, and the armrest also gives you enough comfort. And then of course there is added practicality because you have a couple of cup holders. Not really the last word in quality. You always get a sense that it makes this hollow noise and does not really give you the feel of quality as such, but I think we have rambled enough about the quality issues in the car, so I'm not really going to go there. One ergonomic issue at the back is because the power window buttons are here in the center. Again, it's a bit of a reach first of all, and it's just an ergonomic nightmare for people. So I think Citroën should have kind of altered that. But overall, two people will sit in fairly decent comfort in the back seats. There is another version which is a 5+2, and Citroën has categorically said that the C3 Aircross is not a 7-seater, it is a 5+2. What that means, the last row of the seats can be removed, and then what you get is a very huge and very usable boot space, and packing in a lot of luggage is not going to be a problem at all. You don't often see a key like this. This is very unique to Citroën. Anyway, on with the C3 Aircross. How's it to drive? Well, the first thing that you notice is the gear stick. The lever has a very stupid top. I think what Citroën should do is offer a different top or the gear knob in their parts catalog. So people who want to accessorize a car, they can at least choose a different gear knob. But the gear shift quality itself, that is pretty okay, and the gearbox generally performs very, very well. This engine is pretty much the same as the C3. So it's a 1.2 liter 3-cylinder engine, makes about 110 horsepower and 190 Newton meter. And the numbers come in at exactly the same RPM level as well. But the C3 Aircross feels a little different to drive. The C3 hatch, completely different car, much lighter than this. The weight difference between the standard C3 hatch and the C3 Aircross is between 250 to 300 kilos. So there is a fair amount of heft in this one. And still, the engine feels sprightly enough. I really did not think that it, with the same level of power, going to perform admirably, but it has. And we did not really load up the car in a big way. We did not have full house in here, 7 people or 6 people, not that. We were 3 fairly well-fed guys, fairly big guys, with a fair amount of luggage. So it was not light, but it was not up to full capacity. But even so, it performed fairly okay. And we have been unfortunately driving on fairly straight roads, very nice highway sections. We have not had any guard areas or any inclines that we have been able to climb. No such application. But on such open highways, on straight roads, very smooth tarmac, the build-up of speed from the engine has been very decent. I was doing about 75 kilometers per hour in 6th gear, and I had 1500 RPM on the tacho. Now, 1500 RPM you would imagine is pretty okay. The moment you put your foot down, it should gain pace. But the progress was not as linear and not as rapid as I would have liked. It was very, very slow. And then I dropped the RPMs further. I went down to as low as 1000 RPM to see how flexible is the engine and how easily it gains the speed. But the struggle is definitely there, and it is characteristic of any turbo engine. You would expect a little bit of a shove, but that also is not the case here. The build-up is okay. It's not really something that is going to leave you absolutely surprised. That's not the case. But it's nice and it's gradual. Keep it above 1500 RPM and you'll be satisfied. The moment you start going below that, that's where the trouble starts. But having said that, it is best when it goes beyond 2000 RPM. And again, I'm just a little disappointed that we don't have any steep inclines to really see the nature and the energy of this engine. I suspect it's going to be a little bit of a struggle even after 2000 RPM with full load or full capacity. But we'll only be able to gauge that when we get the car for a longer duration of time and we're able to do all the tests the way we want to do them. But in isolation, with 3 fairly well-built guys on board and some luggage, driving on very straight roads, open highways, this thing has not struggled at all. The high-speed stability, that has also been good. And we did really try and max it out. We went to about 160 kilometers per hour, but really did not have any trouble at all. The steering is a bit of a concern for me. In terms of response, it's absolutely fine, but when you settle down at a steady pace, it just feels a little sticky. And I appreciate the fact that Citroën has thought of giving it some heft, some weight, but that weight feels a little artificial. Again, the response is okay, but just the way you turn and it feels in your hands, it just reminds you of some Marutis because they also have a very sticky nature. It's not as bad, but it still gives you a little artificial, little synthetic feel. That could have been bettered, but otherwise the steering actually feels pretty okay, and I absolutely love the steering wheel. It's a very nice small diameter unit, and the layout and the design is also pretty attractive. Citroën clearly says that the C3 Aircross is an SUV. In my classification, it's not. I would still think this is a crossover, but they did make us drive the C3 Aircross on some little off-roady bits. They had a separate track created, and of course you're going to have the visuals also now coming on the screen. But to be honest, those obstacles were manicured, and they were built on purpose to essentially display what this car can do. Almost 95% of that stuff, any car can negotiate those kind of things. So it's not really ready for the rough in the truest sense of the word, but it has great ground clearance, 200 millimeters, and that's fairly decent, fairly plenty. So it will negotiate most of the rough stuff, and it will go on some bad patches without any problem. But the fact that Citroën was brave enough to do this kind of a setup is commendable. And yes, there was one obstacle which I think a car of this sort has a little bit of an advantage on when you compare it against some other slightly more compromised crossovers, was the side incline. So the negative incline was nice, you could negotiate. But other than that, there was nothing really out there which was really troubling, and it would not have been troubling for a lot of other cars even. But the central point of such an activity was to highlight the approach and the departure angles. The C3 Aircross has the approach angle of 20.5 degrees and a departure angle of 25 degrees. So it's just there as numbers and it's good to flaunt. But really, in terms of the hardware, there is nothing that is going to take you off-road and get you out of some very tricky situations. So do not attempt that. Now, I mentioned that the engine feels a little different to the C3 hatch, and despite of the numbers being the same, the way it responds is slightly different. That's down to basically 2 or 3 bits. One is that the FDR, or the final drive ratio, that has been altered. The second is that the throttle mapping or the throttle response rate has also changed by almost 30%, I guess. So it requires now less effort, and the throttle pedal is a bit more sensitive to your inputs. So the moment you press the accelerator pedal, the engine response is going to be that much quicker, and that is what makes you feel that the engine has been played around with. It's been tweaked to a certain extent to make this feel like it's slightly peppier, and despite of the weight gain of about 250 kilos, it still is pretty decent on performance. Citroën did not give us the power and torque curves despite of us asking. I don't know why, but I suspect that the torque curve would be heavily in favor of the mid-range. I think that's where this car feels the happiest, and that's where you also get the most amount of performance. So that mid-range is going to be very nice and pretty much off a plateau almost on the graph. And generally speaking, this engine fits the nature and the application of this car pretty perfectly. Summing up the C3 Aircross, I think the fundamentals are all there. It's a fairly decent looking car. On the outside, it really does not have anything that's offensive. It's got a good balance on the road, the stance is good. So on that aspect, it's absolutely on point. On the inside, things could have been slightly better. The quality could have been better. We've also shown you some iffy bits here and there. But what Citroën has done with the C3 Aircross is address a category which has great potential. This gives you the desirability of an SUV body shape with the practicality and the flexibility of an MPV with 3-row seating. So that's a game which largely nobody's playing in a very serious way right now. Citroën can definitely make a mark in this space. So it's essentially going to compete against the likes of the Maruti Suzuki Ertiga, the XL6, the Kia Carens, all these cars at one end, and then probably the Kushaq and the Volkswagen Tiguan at the other end. They are definitely not going to go up against the likes of the Kia Seltos and the Hyundai Creta. That's a no-go territory for them. The biggest USP of the car is the ride quality in my view. The sophistication of the suspension is there for you to feel, and nothing in this category is going to come close to giving you the sense of ride comfort that this car offers. The C3 Aircross is a very functional approach to this category, which is basically between 10 and 15 lakh rupees. But whether people are going to choose the fundamentals and the very basic functionality, or they would want to go for the fancy features list that the other rivals offer, that's something that only time will tell.